Death has a way of exposing family secrets. But what I found in Dad's study that morning wasn't just any secret, it was a confession that would tear our perfect family portrait to shreds. I stood there, fingers trembling around the envelope I'd discovered tucked behind his collection of first edition Hemingways. The paper felt delicate, almost fragile, like it might crumble under the weight of its contents. Dad's distinctive scrawl across the front simply read, "For Piper, when the time is right." The study still smelled like him, leather, pipe tobacco, and that fancy cologne Grace had given him last Christmas. Grace. Always Grace. Even now, 3 days after the funeral, I could hear her downstairs, consoling Mom with that practiced tone of sympathy she'd perfected over the years. "I just don't know what we'll do without him," Grace's voice drifted up. "But don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of everything." Of course she would. She always did. I sank into Dad's leather chair, the one where he'd spent countless evenings reviewing contracts while I sat on the floor nearby, pretending to read but really just wanting to be close to him. The letter opened with a soft tear. "My dearest Piper, I've failed you. For years, I've watched you fade into the background while your sister took center stage. I convinced myself it was for the best, that Grace needed the attention more, that you were stronger, more capable of handling the shadows. But I was wrong. So terribly wrong." My throat tightened. Below, Grace's laugh echoed through the house, that perfect, musical sound that had always made heads turn and hearts melt. "There are things you need to know, things I should have told you years ago. About the company. About Grace. About why your mother and I made the choices we did. But most importantly, about the trust fund and what really happened to it." The words blurred as tears threatened to spill. I blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. 28 years of being the strong one had taught me that much. Your sister isn't who everyone thinks she is. The night before I changed my will, she came to me with, "Piper? What are you doing in here?" I jumped, crumpling the letter against my chest. Mom stood in the doorway, her face pinched with disapproval. Even in grief, she managed to make me feel like an intruder in my own home. "Just looking through some of Dad's things," I said, sliding the letter into my pocket. "Someone needs to start organizing everything." "Grace is handling that," Mom replied automatically. "She's already contacted the estate lawyer and..." "Of course she has." The words came out sharper than intended. Mom's lips thinned. "I know this is hard for you, dear, but there's no need for that tone. Your sister is trying to help. Like she always does." I stood up, suddenly unable to breathe in the suffocating space. "Has anyone asked what I might want to do? What role I might want to take? Piper, please. This isn't the time for..." "When is the time, Mom? When Grace has already divided up everything? When she's decided what happens to Dad's business? To this house?" The silence that followed was heavy with 28 years of unspoken words. "We're having dinner in an hour," Mom finally said, her voice carefully controlled. "Try to be pleasant. For your sister's sake. She's taking all this very hard." I watched her retreat, then pulled out the letter again. The last paragraph caught my eye. "Remember this, Piper, sometimes the greatest act of love is finally standing up for yourself. When you're ready, look behind the painting in my study, the one of the lighthouse. What you'll find there will change everything. All my love. Dad." I turned toward the painting, my heart pounding. Behind me, Grace's voice floated up again, sweet as honey and twice as thick. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the familiar urge to fade into the background. Instead, I felt something new. Something dangerous. Something like revenge. The lighthouse painting mocked me throughout dinner, its secrets burning a hole in my pocket alongside Dad's letter. Grace had outdone herself with the meal, her signature roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, Dad's favorite. Of course. I was thinking, Grace announced, cutting into her meat with surgical precision, about converting Dad's study into a home office. For the business. My fork clattered against the plate. You're what? Well, someone needs to take over Johnson and Associates. She dabbed her lips with a napkin, the perfect picture of composure. Dad was grooming me for it, after all. The lie sat there between us, bold as brass. Dad had never mentioned grooming Grace for anything except perhaps Olympic-level manipulation. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Mom beamed. Tom would have wanted. Actually, I cut in, Dad left some specific instructions about the company. The letter felt heavy in my pocket. But I wasn't ready to reveal that card yet. We should probably wait until we've spoken with his lawyer. Grace's smile flickered for just a moment. Oh. Did he discuss something with you that I should know about? Funny you should ask. I reached for my wine glass, noting how Grace's knuckles whitened around her fork. What exactly did Dad say to you the night before he changed his will? The silence that followed was absolute. Even Mom stopped eating, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. I don't know what you're talking about, Grace said, but there was a new edge to her voice. Mom, these potatoes are divine. Did you use rosemary? Don't change the subject, Grace. I leaned forward. What did you do? Piper! Mom's sharp tone could have cut glass. Your sister is trying to hold this family together, and you're being absolutely. Holding us together? I laughed, the sound harsh even to my own ears. Is that what we're calling it now? Grace set down her cutlery with deliberate care. I know you're hurting, Piper. We all are. But lashing out isn't going to bring Dad back. Don't you dare use Dad to manipulate me. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Not after what you did. What I did. Grace's voice rose slightly, her perfect mask slipping. What exactly are you accusing me of? Girls, please, Mom intervened, reaching for Grace's hand. This isn't the time. It's never the time, is it, Mom? I moved toward the study door. Well, maybe it's time to look behind some closed doors. Or should I say, behind some paintings? Grace's face went white. She knocked over her wine glass as she stood, red liquid spreading across the pristine tablecloth like blood. Piper, wait. But I was already at the study door. Grace reached me just as I pushed it open, her fingers digging into my arm. You don't understand, she hissed, low enough that Mom couldn't hear. There are things you don't know about Dad, about the company. Then enlighten me. I jerked my arm free. Tell me why you visited him that night. Tell me what you said that made him change everything. I was protecting us. Her voice cracked, showing the first real emotion I'd seen from her since Dad's death. If you'd just let me handle this. Like you've handled everything else? I moved toward the lighthouse painting. Always taking control, always pushing me aside. Stop! The word exploded from her with such force that Mom appeared in the doorway, wringing her hands. What's going on? Grace, darling, are you all right? I reached for the painting. Don't, Grace whispered, and for the first time, I heard fear in her voice. Real fear. I turned to look at her, my hands still on the frame. Why not? What are you so afraid I'll find? Her next words stopped me cold. Because if you look behind that painting, you'll destroy everything. Including yourself. The worst part wasn't the threat in her voice. It was the pity. Martha's garden gnomes watched me with judgmental ceramic eyes as I crossed her front lawn the next morning. I'd seen her watching our house during the previous night's drama, her silhouette visible through her kitchen window like some neighborhood sentinel. Well, if it isn't the other Johnson girl. Martha opened her door before I could knock, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. I suppose you're here about the commotion last night. Actually, I'm here about Dad. I followed her into a living room that smelled of cats and coffee. And about Grace. Martha's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. Aren't we all always about Grace? She poured coffee into delicate cups that probably hadn't seen daylight since the Reagan administration. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were sharp when she looked at me. Your father came to see me, you know. 2 days before he died. The coffee scalded my tongue. What? Oh yes. Quite upset, he was. Something about irregularities in the company books. She paused, studying my face. Books that Grace had been handling. My chest tightened. What kind of irregularities? The kind that end with federal investigations. Martha set down her cup with a decisive clink. Your sister's been cooking those books for years. Tom finally caught on when he noticed discrepancies in the pension fund. The room tilted sideways. The pension fund. Dad's pride and joy, meant to secure retirement for every employee who'd ever worked for Johnson and Associates. But that's impossible. Grace wouldn't. Wouldn't she? Martha's voice turned gentle. Think about it, dear. The designer clothes, the luxury apartment, that fancy car of hers. Did you ever wonder how a junior executive could afford all that? My hands started shaking so badly I had to set down my cup. Dad confronted her, didn't he? That night before he changed his will. He did more than confront her. Martha reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. He gave me these to hold on to. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got them. The envelope contained spreadsheets, bank statements, and a USB drive. But it was the last item that made my blood run cold, a formal letter of confession, signed by Grace, admitting to years of systematic embezzlement. She blackmailed him, I whispered. That's why he changed the will. She threatened to what? Take the fall publicly? Drag the company's name through the mud? Martha's silence was answer enough. But why give these to you? Because I'm the only one your mother doesn't talk to anymore. Martha's smile was bitter. Not since I caught Helen with that tennis instructor 20 years ago. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Mom had an affair? Oh, honey. Martha reached across and patted my hand. Why do you think Grace has always been the favorite? Guilt is a powerful motivator. My phone buzzed, a text from Grace. Where are you? Mom's worried. Come home and we can talk about everything. Another buzz, family first, remember? I looked at the evidence in my hands, then at Martha. What am I supposed to do with all this? That depends. Martha's eyes were kind but unflinching. Do you want justice, or do you want revenge? Because believe me, there's a difference. And what's the difference? Justice might save the company, might even save your sister from herself. She paused. Revenge will destroy everything, including parts of yourself you might want to keep. I stood up, gathering the documents. Maybe some things need to be destroyed before they can be rebuilt. Just like your father, Martha murmured. He said almost the same thing that last day. Right before his heart attack. I froze halfway to the door. His heart attack? Curious timing, wasn't it? Martha's voice followed me out. The very next morning after his confrontation with Grace. The doctors called it stress-induced, but she let the sentence hang unfinished in the air between us. Outside, the morning sun felt too bright, too harsh. My phone buzzed again with another message from Grace. Whatever you're planning, don't. Please. Some secrets should stay buried. I looked down at the envelope in my hands, then up at our family home, where Grace stood watching from Dad's study window. Some secrets should stay buried. But I was done living in the shadows of other people's lies. The USB drive from Martha's envelope sat on my laptop like a digital grenade. Behind me, Dad's lighthouse painting watched, still guarding its own secrets. I hadn't touched it since that night. Some truths demand perfect timing. My phone lit up with Grace's 15th message, the board meeting's tomorrow. Last chance to talk. I plugged in the drive. Folders appeared, labeled by year, each containing meticulous records of Grace's creative accounting. But it was a video file that caught my eye, tj_final_statement.mp4. Dad's face filled my screen, looking exhausted, recorded the night before his death. If you're watching this, Piper, then I failed to make things right. He rubbed his face, and I noticed his hands shaking. Grace has given me an ultimatum. Either I sign over controlling interest in the company, or she releases documents showing years of tax evasion, documents she fabricated. But convincing enough to destroy everything we've built. A knock at my door made me jump. Grace stood there, wearing the same cream blazer she'd worn to Dad's funeral. I slammed my laptop shut. Ever heard of waiting for an answer? We need to talk. She closed the door behind her, eyes scanning my room. About Dad's study. About the painting. About how you killed him. The words hung between us like smoke. Grace's perfect posture faltered for just a moment. Is that what Martha told you? Her laugh sounded hollow. That bitter old woman has been trying to destroy our family for years. The evidence suggests you've been doing a pretty good job of that yourself. Grace moved to my window, staring out at Martha's house. You have no idea what Dad was really like. What he made me do. Made you do? I stood up, anger rising. He gave you everything. The attention, the opportunities, the pressure. She whirled around. Perfect Grace, golden child, future CEO. Do you know what it's like, living up to impossible expectations? Having to be flawless every single day? Poor you, I spat. Try being invisible. You think I wanted that for you? Her voice cracked. Dad used us against each other from the beginning. He'd praise me to punish you, then threaten me with you taking over whenever I failed. Piper would never disappoint me like this. Piper understands responsibility. I opened my laptop again, turning it toward her. Is that why you embezzled millions from the pension fund? To prove something to Dad? Her face went blank, that perfect mask sliding back into place. Those records are inadmissible. And incomplete. Incomplete? Check the dates. She moved closer, perfectly manicured nail tapping the screen. Dad's signature authorized every transfer. He knew exactly what was happening to that money. You're lying. Am I? She pulled out her phone, showing me emails between her and Dad. He needed someone to blame if things went wrong. Who better than the golden child? The perfect scapegoat. My head spun. But your confession letter. Insurance. Her smile was razor sharp. Dad taught me well, always keep leverage. She headed for the door, then paused. You have until tomorrow's board meeting to decide whose side you're really on. Family protects family, Piper. Even from themselves. After she left, I replayed Dad's video, watching for any sign of deception. His familiar features blurred as he spoke his final words. I've failed you both, but you can still save each other. Behind the painting. The truth will set you free, but first it will break your heart. I moved to the study, my fingers trembling as they touched the lighthouse painting's frame. Inside my pocket, Grace's final text buzzed, "Some things are better left buried. Don't make me choose between protecting you and protecting myself." The painting felt heavier than it should as I lifted it from the wall. Behind it, a small wall safe waited, and with it, answers that would change everything. But whose truth would I find? Dad's final confession, or Grace's perfect lie? Only one way to find out. The safe's contents spilled across Dad's desk like evidence at a crime scene. Bank statements. Legal documents. A small black notebook filled with Dad's cramped handwriting. And beneath it all, a single photograph I'd never seen before, Dad and Grace at her college graduation, both smiling. His hand gripping her shoulder so tightly his knuckles were white. The board meeting was in 3 hours. My suitcase waited by the door, packed with everything I couldn't bear to leave behind. Planning a trip? Mom stood in the doorway, her face a perfect mask of concern. Just like Grace's. Just like every mask in this house of lies. I'm leaving. I gathered the documents, shoving them into my bag. I know about the pension fund. About Dad's involvement. About everything. She moved into the room with deliberate steps. Your father did what he had to do to protect this family. By stealing from his employees? By using Grace as a shield? By keeping us together? Her voice hardened. Something you seem determined to destroy. I pulled out Dad's notebook, flipping to a marked page. Did you know he was recording everything? Every threat, every manipulation, every time Grace came to him crying because the pressure was too much. Mom's hand shot out, faster than I expected, but I jerked the notebook away. You don't understand what's at stake, she hissed. I understand perfectly. Dad built his empire on fraud, used Grace as his puppet, and now you're trying to bury everything to protect your perfect little world. To protect you. The words exploded from her. Everything we did was to protect you. From what? From becoming like him. She grabbed the photograph from the desk. Look at her face, Piper. Really look. Do you know why Grace was his favorite? Because she was weak enough to control. But you. Her laugh was bitter. You were too much like him. Too stubborn. Too dangerous. The truth hit like a physical blow. You pushed me away to save me? And now you're proving us right. She stepped closer. Going to the board meeting with your evidence, your righteous anger. Ready to burn it all down. Just like he would have done. My phone buzzed. Grace, the board's calling an emergency session. Moving the meeting up. Where are you? I have to go. I grabbed my suitcase. If you do this, there's no coming back. Mom's voice followed me down the hall. You'll destroy Grace. Is that what you want? To become the monster you think she is? I stopped at the front door, Dad's notebook heavy in my hand. Through the window, I could see Martha in her garden, watching. Always watching. Maybe we're all monsters, I said. Maybe that's the real family legacy. Piper, please. But I was already moving, my feet carrying me toward the car, toward the board meeting, toward whatever truth or lie waited at the end of this path. Another text from Grace, I know what you found in the safe. Remember when we were kids? How we promised to always protect each other. Please, don't make me break that promise. I started the engine, the familiar rumble matching my racing heart. In the rearview mirror, Mom stood in the doorway, one hand pressed against her chest. Beyond her, I could see Dad's study window, the empty space where the lighthouse painting had hung for 20 years. The painting itself lay in my trunk, wrapped in an old blanket. I hadn't checked behind it yet, one last mystery, one last truth to uncover. But first, the board meeting. First, the reckoning. My phone buzzed one final time. Martha, whatever you decide, remember, revenge and justice aren't the same thing. Your father never learned the difference. Will you? I pulled away from the house, leaving behind everything I'd ever known about family, about love, about truth itself. In 3 hours, I would either save my sister or destroy her. In 3 hours, I would either become my father's daughter or break free of his legacy forever. In 3 hours, I would learn if some monsters are born, or if they're created by the very people who claim to love them. The Johnson & Associates boardroom felt smaller than I remembered, shrunk by the weight of 20 pairs of eyes fixed on the USB drive in my hand. Grace sat at the head of the table, Dad's old seat, her cream blazer a stark contrast against the dark wood. As I was saying, she continued smoothly, as if my entrance hadn't interrupted her mid-sentence. The transition plan following my father's death ensures stability for all stakeholders. Before we continue, I placed the drive on the table, watching it spin slightly like a compass needle seeking north. There's something the board needs to see. Grace's smile didn't waver, but her knuckles whitened around her pen. My sister is understandably emotional given recent events. Perhaps we should discuss the pension fund. The words fell like stones into still water. And why it's currently $8 million lighter than it should be. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Board member Davidson leaned forward, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. Miss Johnson, what exactly are you suggesting? I reached for the drive, but Grace's hand shot out, covering mine. Her fingers were ice cold. Don't, she whispered. Please. For a moment, I was 8 years old again, watching Grace cry after falling from her bike, promising to never let anything hurt her again. Then I remembered Dad's notebook, the photograph, the years of manipulation. I pulled away, plugging in the drive. The documents I'm about to show you, I started, but Grace cut me off. Were fabricated by our father to cover his own fraud. The room went silent. On the screen behind me, numbers scrolled past, dates, transactions, signatures. Dad was embezzling funds for years, Grace continued, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. I discovered it 6 months ago. Everything I did was to protect the company, to protect our employees. That's not, I stopped, staring at the documents. Something was wrong. The signatures, the dates. I tried to stop him, Grace's voice cracked perfectly. When he found out I knew, he threatened to frame me. That's why he changed his will, why he left those false records. He knew I would expose him eventually. Davidson was nodding. Others were murmuring sympathetically. I fumbled through Dad's notebook, but the pages seemed different somehow, dates altered, entries changed. You switched them, I whispered. When did you? The real question, Grace addressed the board, is why my sister is so desperate to destroy our father's legacy. To destroy this company. That's not what, but I could hear myself stammering, see the board members' expressions shifting from concern to suspicion. I moved to reject these unsubstantiated allegations, Davidson announced, and proceed with the leadership transition as planned. All in favor? Grace asked softly. Hands rose around the table like a forest of judgment. In my pocket, my phone buzzed, a message from Mom, I warned you. Some truths are better left buried. I think, Grace said, still gentle, still perfect, my sister needs time to grieve properly. Perhaps a leave of absence. You can't just. All in favor? More hands. More sympathetic looks. More perfect manipulation. I backed toward the door, clutching Dad's notebook, useless now, tainted by doubt. Grace's victory smile flickered across her face for just a moment before concern replaced it. Piper, wait. But I was already running, past the reception desk, past the family photos in the lobby. Past everything I thought I knew about truth and justice and family. In my car, another text waited, Martha this time. Check behind the painting. Now. The lighthouse painting lay in my trunk, still wrapped in its blanket. With trembling fingers, I turned it over, finding a small tear in the backing. Inside was a single micro SD card. My phone buzzed one final time. Grace, I know about the painting. Remember what Dad always said? In chess, the queen protects the king. But he never told us what happens when the king is gone and there can only be one queen. I stared at the SD card, then at the company building rising behind me like a glass and steel tombstone. One last truth. One last chance. But was I ready to see what was really hiding behind the lighthouse's beam? The SD card's contents played across Martha's ancient desktop computer, the footage grainy but clear enough. Dad's study, late at night. Grace entering, tears streaming down her face. Their argument escalating until. He had a heart attack right there, Martha said quietly. While threatening to destroy her. But she didn't call for help. My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. She just. Watched. For 18 minutes. Martha's garden gnomes stared through the window, silent witnesses to another family's destruction. Then she made it look like she just found him. My phone buzzed, Grace, again, where are you? The memorial starts in an hour. The memorial. Of course. One last performance for the grieving daughter. I have to go. I stood, pocketing the SD card. Thank you, Martha. For everything. She caught my arm. Remember, revenge might feel like justice, but it burns everything it touches. The church was already full when I arrived. Grace stood at the podium, radiant in black, her eulogy reducing the board members to tears. Mom sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes. I walked straight up the center aisle. He was the kind of father who always put family first, Grace was saying. Who taught us about integrity, about watching someone die? My voice carried through the church. About letting your father have a heart attack while you stood there for 18 minutes? The silence was absolute. Grace's perfect mask slipped for just a moment. Piper, she recovered smoothly, grief affects us all differently. Perhaps you should. Perhaps we should watch the video. I held up the SD card. Dad's study has security cameras. Did you forget that when you let him die? Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Mom stood up, reaching for me, but I stepped away. You don't understand, Grace's voice cracked. He was going to destroy everything. The company, our family, my future. Because you were stealing from it. Because he made me. The words exploded from her. Every transaction, every fraud, it was all him. I was just trying to fix it, to protect everyone, and he threatened to expose you? I moved closer to the podium. Like you threatened to expose him? Grace's composure shattered. He deserved it. Do you know what it's like, being his perfect little puppet? Having to dance on his strings while he pulled them tighter and tighter? Girls, please, Mom intervened, but we ignored her. So you watched him die. I was close enough now to see Grace trembling. Your own father. He wasn't a father. Grace's mascara ran in black streaks. He was a monster who created another monster. Isn't that right, Mom? Isn't that why you kept Piper away? Because you saw him in her? The congregation gasped. Mom froze, her face ashen. But you were wrong, Grace continued, laughing hysterically. I'm the one who became him. I'm the one who learned his games, his manipulation, his... Enough! Mom's voice cracked like a whip. Both of you, stop this. But it was too late. Board members were standing, phones recording. Davidson's face had turned purple with rage. The truth hurts, doesn't it, Mom? I held up Dad's notebook. Just like it hurt when Dad found out about the tennis instructor? When he used that knowledge to control you, just like he controlled Grace? Piper, don't, Grace reached for me. Don't what? Tell the truth? Isn't that what this whole thing has been about? The truth? Grace's laugh was bitter. The truth is, we're all monsters here. Every single one of us. The only difference is, I admitted it to myself a long time ago. She turned to face the shocked congregation, spreading her arms wide. Welcome to the real Johnson family. We're not what you thought we were. We never were. The chaos that followed was almost beautiful in its destruction. As security led Grace away from the podium, as board members shouted for lawyers, as Mom collapsed into her seat, I stood in the center of it all. Feeling strangely empty. Martha's words echoed in my head, revenge burns everything it touches. I looked down at the SD card in my hand, then at my sisters retreating back. And wondered if some fires were necessary to clear the way for something new to grow. The real estate agent's heels clicked against the hardwood floors of my childhood home, her voice echoing through empty rooms. The bank is motivated to sell, given the circumstances. Your offer is quite generous, considering. I'll take it. I signed the papers without hesitation, my name stark against the white paper. Piper Johnson, no longer in anyone's shadow. Grace's trial was set for next month. The news had called it everything from corporate fraud to criminal negligence, but none of the headlines captured the truth. We were all guilty of something. Mom hadn't spoken to me since the memorial. Her silence said more than words ever could. I moved through the house, rooms stripped bare except for Dad's study. The lighthouse painting hung there again, restored to its place like a sentinel. But this time, I knew what lay behind it, not just the safe, but generations of carefully crafted lies. The doorbell rang. Martha stood on the porch, holding a cardboard box. Found these while cleaning out my attic, she said, setting it down. Thought you might want them. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Me and Grace as children, before the manipulation began. Before Dad's games turned us into players instead of daughters. Before Mom's guilt shaped us into what she feared and what she hoped for. Grace asked about you, Martha said quietly. During visiting hours. I stiffened. And? She said something interesting. About the night your father died. Martha's eyes were kind but unflinching. About how he admitted everything just before his heart attack. The affairs, the fraud, using both of you as pawns. She said she watched him die because she couldn't bear to save another monster. My hands trembled over the photographs. Why are you telling me this? Because revenge and justice aren't the only paths to freedom. Sometimes understanding is enough. I thought of Grace in her prison cell, of Mom in her self-imposed exile, of Dad's final manipulations reaching beyond the grave. We were all prisoners of our own making. The sound of a car door closing drew our attention. Mom stood in the driveway, looking smaller somehow, more human. The tennis instructor, she said without preamble. He wasn't the first. Or the last. Your father. He knew about all of them. Used them to control me, like he used everything else. I let him favor Grace because I thought it would protect her. Instead, we all became what we feared most, I finished. She nodded, tears falling. I'm selling the company. Using the money to repay the pension fund. And Grace? Will serve her time. But when she gets out. Mom straightened, finding her strength. We'll try again. All of us. If you want. Martha squeezed my hand and left us there. Her garden gnomes watching from across the street as mother and daughter stood in the wreckage of their perfect family facade. I walked Mom to the study, where the lighthouse painting still hung. Together, we took it down, revealing the empty safe behind it. He taught us all how to hide, Mom whispered. Then maybe it's time to learn how to be seen. I turned the painting over, finding one last surprise, a handwritten note tucked into the frame, Dad's familiar scrawl faded but clear. To my daughters, the lighthouse warns ships away from dangerous shores. But sometimes the greatest danger lies in the safe harbor we never dare to leave. Be braver than I was. Be better. Be free. Mom touched the words gently. Will you stay? In this house? Yes, I said. But not to preserve his legacy or protect our secrets. I'm staying to build something new. Something true. Through the study window, I could see Martha in her garden, tending to her gnomes. Beyond her, the sun set over our quiet street, where perfect families lived in perfect houses, each with their own lighthouses. Their own dangerous shores. But here, in this house of broken mirrors and shattered illusions, something else was possible. Something real. I hung a different painting in place of the lighthouse, a simple sunrise, full of promise and uncertainty. Sometimes the greatest act of revenge is choosing to stop playing the game altogether.